In the scorching dawn light that spilled across the rolling plains beneath the ancient Syrian sky, the world felt as though it held its breath, waiting for destiny to carve new scars into its already blood-stained soil. And as the golden sun climbed slowly above the horizon, its rays glinted off thousands of bronze helmets, chariot wheels, spearheads, and curved Egyptian swords that lined the marching columns of Pharaoh Rameses II, who rode at the front of his great army with the pride of a ruler born for battle, the weight of a kingdom upon his shoulders, and the fire of a man determined to carve his name into eternity. Yet beneath his confident gaze lay a storm of worry, tension, and memory of every king before him who had fallen to treachery, ambition, or the cruel unpredictability of war. Because the lands stretching northward toward Kadesh were not simply territories marked on stone maps but places soaked in rivalries, betrayals, shifting loyalties, and the ancient hatred between Egypt and the mighty Hittite Empire, whose ruler King Muwatalli had already set traps like a master hunter waiting for the lion to step into the snare. And as the dust rose around the hooves of Egyptian horses and the chariot wheels left deep grooves in the earth, soldiers whispered quietly among themselves, speaking of omens, dreams, and memories of homewives tending gardens along the Nile, children playing in muddy streets, the distant fragrance of fish markets, the laughter of families preparing for festivals, each man silently praying he would see those sights again. For the march ahead was long, perilous, and filled with shadows of hidden enemies. Rameses, though adorned in shimmering armor inlaid with gold, felt the weight of responsibility heavier than the armor itself, and he knew well that even a king could be swallowed by the chaos of combat. Yet he pressed forward, remembering the teachings of his father Seti, the victories he had studied since youth, and the relentless discipline he had forged into his soldiers, who marched in for great divisions Amon, Ra, Ptah, and Set, each like a living river of men flowing toward an uncertain fate. While messengers rode back and forth delivering orders, scouts raced ahead to search for signs of the Hittites, and priests muttered prayers to Amun-Ra, beseeching the gods to bless their journey with victory, strength, and clarity of mind. The heat grew thicker as the army advanced, sweat trickling down the faces of warriors who tasted dust with every breath. And though many tried to hide their fear, their hearts beat rapidly with the awareness that ancient rivalries were not fought with honor alone but with deception, ambush, and desperate brutality. And stories passed from camp to camp spoke of the Hittites' heavy chariots capable of smashing through ranks like thunder, of their warriors who wielded iron weapons with terrifying skill, and of King Muwatalli's cunning that rivaled the serpent's. Of the desert, for he was a man who understood strategy as deeply as a priest understood scripture, a ruler who believed victory belonged not to the strongest but to the most patient, the most silent, the one who struck unseen until the final moment. As the Egyptians marched deeper into contested lands, strange footprints were found along riverbanks. Broken branches in the forests hinted at recent movement, and scouts returned with conflicting reports, some claiming the Hittites had retreated north, others insisting they hid behind Kadesh's fortified walls. And two captured men, trembling and desperate, told Rameses the Hittite army had fled in fear of his might. But the pharaoh's generals exchanged troubled glances, sensing the story was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with hope rather than truth. Yet Rameses, believing the gods favored him, pushed forward with the Amman division far ahead of the others, not knowing that the captured men were disguised Hittite spies sent by Muwatalli to lure him into a deadly trap that would echo through history for thousands of years. And as the pharaoh's chariot rolled over the hills and the towering city of Kadesh appeared in the distance, its stone walls rising like the spine of a sleeping giant, surrounded by farmland scorched by conflict, Rameses felt a sudden chill despite the heat, sensing the invisible eyes watching him from distant thickets, the silent calculations of hidden generals, and the steady breath of an enemy army concealed behind the hills like wolves waiting for the perfect moment to pounce, while his own soldiers, exhausted from marching, began to set up camp, unaware that beneath the calm breeze and peaceful rustling of grass lurked the makings of one of the greatest ambushes in ancient history. Mothers' lullabies spoken long ago beside the Nile replayed in the minds of young soldiers. Veterans sharpened their blades quietly, replaying every mistake they had ever made in battle. Chariot drivers inspected reins, wheels, and axles with trembling hands. Archers tested their bows, feeling the tension in the string reflect the tension in their own spirits. And priests sprinkled holy water onto the earth, chanting protection spells whose words were nearly swallowed by the vastness of the open plains. Meanwhile, far from Ramesses' sight, hidden in forests and ravines, the Hittite chariots stood ready, thousands of them each equipped with warriors trained for swift, brutal strikes, their horses restless, snorting, muscles trembling. And King Muwatalli himself watched the Egyptian advance with cold patience, like a hunter waiting for the lion to step into the pit, knowing that the moment Rameses realized the truth, it would already be too late. And as the sky darkened to a deep, majestic red, signaling the end of the day, the world seemed to tighten around both armies, drawing them toward a collision that would shake kingdoms, rewrite borders, and carve unforgettable legends of bravery, loss, betrayal, desperation, and the unbreakable will of men who fought not only for their kings but for the memory of their ancestors. the pride of their gods, and the fragile hope of returning home alive as the storm of Kadesh drew ever nearer, waiting to erupt with the fury of 1,000 suns. In the weeks that followed the first clashes on the river plain, the kingdom felt as if it were holding its breath, for every sunrise carried whispers of either hope or doom, and every sunset reminded them that the enemy drew closer with a hunger sharpened by ambition and centuries of enmity. The people in villages tucked between the hills began storing grain in clay jars, tethering their goats in hidden pens, and offering prayers at old shrines whose carvings had nearly faded, while rumors spread of scouts disappearing in the reeds or arrows found buried deep in tree trunks as if placed by ghosts. And all the while, King Aretas, turned battle-scarred and older than the legend's children, recited walked the moonlit corridors of his mountain citadel, thinking not of his crown but of the weight of lives he carried upon his shoulders. Each night he stood upon the high balcony overlooking the valley, the wind tugging at his cloak like a restless hand, the torches below flickering among the ramparts, casting long wavering shadows that looked like spirits pacing the walls, and he would murmur to the stars the names of the warriors lost in the first ambush, vowing that their sacrifice would not drown in silence. Messengers rode in day and night, their horses foaming, their eyes wild with exhaustion, bringing tidings of enemy camps multiplying along the forest's edge, of siege towers rising like monstrous skeletons, of roads blocked, of bridges burned, of mercenaries hired from distant desert kingdoms who fought for coin rather than honor. And yet Arathor did not break. Instead, he summoned his council generals with silver scars, priests with ancient scrolls, scholars who could read omens in shifting winds, and they gathered around a stone table carved generations before, where earlier kings had debated famine, drought, plague, and war. There they argued fiercely. Some insisted they retreat into the mountains where the narrow passes would give them an advantage. Others demanded they strike first, launching a surprise attack under cover of storms predicted by the royal astrologers, while a few spoke of diplomacy, of sending envoys carrying olive branches rather than swords, though even they knew diplomacy rarely survived contact with a conqueror whose armies already tasted early victories. And yet, amidst all this turmoil, Arathor listened not to the loudest voices but to the silence between them, for he had learned long ago that true wisdom lived in the pauses where men doubted themselves. When he finally dismissed the council, he walked alone to the Hall of Ancestors, the chamber lit by braziers whose smoke curled toward carved faces lining the walls, kings and queens of ages forgotten, their eyes chiseled with stern warning or gentle guidance. And he placed both hands upon the cold stone pedestal at the center, whispering for strength, for clarity, for courage to bear what was coming, because he knew war was not merely steel against steel, but fear against hope, despair against the stubborn heartbeat of courage. Outside, storm clouds rolled over the mountains, and thunder rumbled like distant drums calling ancient warriors awake. Shepherds in the foothills swore they saw strange lights flickering through the ruins of the old temple that had stood abandoned for 2 centuries, and the oracle who lived near the river dreamed of a crimson hawk diving into darkness, dropping feathers that turned into burning torches, an omen she believed meant that the kingdom would walk through fire before seeing dawn. Meanwhile, within the barracks, the soldiers sharpened their spears, oiled their shields, and told stories of Arathor's youth, of the time he faced 3 desert raiders alone in a canyon and returned with their blades tied together as a trophy. These stories spread through the ranks like medicine, reminding the warriors that their king was not merely a ruler but a man who had bled beside them. The blacksmiths hammered night and day, sparks flying into the air like meteors, shaping swords whose edges flashed with cold determination, while the village women stitched leather armor and packed herbs into pouches for healing bruises, burns, and arrow wounds. Children peeked from doorways, sensing the fear around them but not understanding why the adults spoke in hushed tones, why the bells rang twice at noon, why the riverboats were pulled ashore and tied with thick ropes as if the water itself might turn against them. But even as fear brewed, bravery also took root. Young men volunteered to join the scouts, old veterans who had long retired strapped on their worn helmets again, and even the monks in the mountain monastery who had sworn to renounce violence prepared to shelter refugees and tend to the wounded when the storm of war finally struck. Every path, every field, every stone seemed to hum with anticipation, as though the land itself understood that destiny was tightening around the kingdom like a closing fist. And all the while, the enemy commander, Lord Malcor, ruthless and brilliant, watched from the forested hills where his banners rippled like tongues of flame. He studied Arathor's movements, analyzed the terrain, questioned captured scouts, and planned to break the kingdom not merely with soldiers but with fear, for he knew that once fear seeped into the heart of a people, victory required little effort afterward. But he miscalculated one thing: the spirit of a kingdom forged under ancient rulers hardened by centuries of storms and droughts, who had taught their descendants that when fate cornered them they would fight not for land or gold but for the right to stand unbroken. And so, as the final days before the great battle approached, Arathor sent out a proclamation across the realm calling every able hand to prepare every village to light signal fires upon the hills at the first sight of enemy torches. And he ordered the great horn made of mammoth ivory and passed down for 9 generations to be placed upon the battlements, ready to summoned the warriors of the realm when the hour of reckoning arrived, and thus beneath a sky trembling with the weight of storms with lightning clawing, the clouds and winds carrying the scent of distant burning, the kingdom braced itself, knowing that the coming days would test blood, will, and destiny in ways no song could ever fully capture. Night fell like a suffocating shroud over the blood-soaked Akarath plains, and the once vibrant grasslands were now a sprawling graveyard lit only by flickering torches, scattered fires, and the silent glow of the moon hanging heavy in the sky like a watchful guardian of the dead. And yet neither army dared retreat to safety, for both Seraphel and Drozacar knew that the battle was not finished, that the war still breathed like a wounded beast waiting for its moment to rise again. And in the dim quiet, Queen Aradel walked among the wounded, her boots treading through mud mixed with blood as soldiers reached for her hands, whispering prayers, fears, and last messages for their families. And though exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, she knelt with each of them, offering comfort, strength, and the reminder that they fought not merely for land but for the legacy of their ancestors. Meanwhile, Malgor the Unbroken sat within his black iron command tent, staring into a bowl of crimson dye used for war markings, his mind replaying every maneuver, every weakness he had detected in Seraphel's lines. And with a voice like grinding stone, he ordered his generals to prepare for a night assault unlike any the plains had ever witnessed. But little did he know that Elder Marone of Seraphel had foreseen such treachery and gathered a circle of mystics around a sacred fire, chanting ancient verses that summoned a protective aura stretching across the sleeping camp. And when Drozacar's scouts attempted to crawl near, they were struck by invisible force that sent them stumbling back in terror, whispering of unseen guardians protecting the Seraphel queen. However, as midnight approached, the spirits stirred in ways even Moran could not control, for the ancient plains themselves were awakening. Memories of past battles rising like shadows in the mist, and Aradel, lying in her tent, felt a strange warmth spreading through her sapphire crown, as though ancestors long gone were reaching out to her, whispering warnings and strength, urging her to prepare for the storm about to break. And break it did when Malgor launched his full attack before dawn, unleashing flaming boulders hurled by massive siege engines and sending waves of armored beasts charging into Seraphel's lines, the ground shaking violently as soldiers scrambled to position. And Aradel, awakened by the thunderous assault, sprang into action, rallying her forces, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade, restoring order where chaos threatened to overwhelm them. The battle raged with renewed ferocity, flames illuminating faces contorted with fear, determination, rage, and valor. And despite being vastly outnumbered, Seraphel's warriors fought like lions, forming tight phalanxes and pushing the enemy back step by step, inch by inch, even as arrows rained down and screams echoed through the plains. But everything shifted when Aradel confronted Malgor directly in the heart of the battlefield, their blades clashing with sparks that lit the darkness, each strike echoing like thunder, each maneuver testing their strength, skill, and will. And though Malgor was larger, stronger, forged from decades of brutal war, Aradel's speed and spirit were unparalleled, as though the ancestors themselves guided her movements. And after a brutal exchange that left the plains silent for a heartbeat, she drove her blade through Malgor's armor, watching the shock flicker in his eyes before he fell to his knees, defeated at last. And with his fall, the Drozacar army hesitated, their once unbreakable resolve cracking as they saw their titan collapse. And Seraphel's soldiers, fueled by a surge of hope, charged forward, scattering the enemy forces until the plains were filled with the sound of retreating footsteps and the cries of victory. And when dawn finally broke, the golden light washing over the battlefield, Aradel stood amidst the fallen, her armor dented, her crown dimmed by dust and blood, yet her heart steady, for she knew Seraphel had survived the greatest trial of its age. And though the scars of the battle would remain etched into the plains and the hearts of her people forever, she also sensed that a new era had begun, one forged through courage, sacrifice, unity, and the unbreakable will of a queen who refused to bow to darkness.